Ja mu nekaj gospodu povedati, da jaz sem davno izjavil, ko njega še ni bilo tukaj, da vsako leto se človek spominja žrtev pretekle vojne. Jaz samo to želim, smo morali v taborišču delati, smo umirani od lakote, od dela. Noben taboriščnik ni bil niti eno minuto brez dela.
It was 1941, and the streets of Vilnius were thick with fear. For the Jewish families trapped behind the walls of the ghetto, survival was a fleeting hope. But deep within the heart of the German war machine, a single man dared to defy the regime he served. Major Karl Plagge, an officer in the Wehrmacht, was no ordinary soldier. Beneath his uniform and stern demeanor lay a secret, one that would risk his life and the lives of countless others. In a world where loyalty to the Reich was demanded, he chose to be loyal to his conscience. It was a cold autumn morning in 1941 when Major Karl Plagge arrived in Vilnius. The once vibrant city, known for its rich Jewish culture and academic excellence, now bore the scars of occupation. Third Reich banners draped over government buildings, and the streets were filled with the sounds of marching boots and whispered prayers. As Plagge stepped onto the cobbled streets, his eyes were drawn to the figures huddled in alleyways, men, women, and children whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of fear and hunger. Plagge, a trained engineer, had been assigned to oversee a military vehicle repair unit known as HKP 562. His orders were simple: keep the army's machinery running efficiently. But what his superiors didn't know was that he had no intention of following orders to the letter. From the moment he set foot in the city, Plagge saw the suffering around him, and something inside him rebelled. He had never agreed with the Third Reich ideology, and he wasn't about to start now. The HKP 562 workshop was a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Vilnius, where vehicles were brought in battered and broken from the Eastern Front. It was a place of grease, metal, and endless labor, but for Plagge, it could be something more. He saw an opportunity, a chance to bend the system in a way that no one would suspect. Under the guise of efficiency, Plagge began recruiting Jewish workers from the ghetto. The official reason was simple: skilled laborers were needed to repair military vehicles. But in reality, Plagge was offering these people a lifeline. Within the factory's walls, they could escape the brutality of the ghetto and the ever-looming threat of deportation. At first, the workers were cautious, unsure of the officer's true intentions. After all, he was a German, an officer of the Wehrmacht. But as days turned to weeks, whispers spread among them. This major was different. He spoke to them with an unusual kindness, ensuring they were fed and their families received extra rations. When SS officers came to inspect, Plagge put on a convincing show, highlighting the workers' productivity while secretly finding ways to keep them safe. One such worker was Miriam Katz, a young woman with sharp eyes and a mechanical mind. Her husband had been taken weeks earlier, and she was left to care for their two small children. When Plagge selected her for the workshop, she thought it was a death sentence in disguise, but instead she found herself in an environment where hope flickered, if only faintly. "Do your work well," Plagge had told her one day in hushed tones, "and you'll survive." As the days passed, Plagge's operation grew bolder. He falsified documents, exaggerating the number of workers needed. He encouraged his officers to look the other way when food supplies accidentally found their way to workers' quarters. And most importantly, he worked tirelessly to shield his workers from the ominous reach of the SS, who prowled the city like wolves, always searching for prey. But Plagge knew that what he was doing came with a heavy risk. The Gestapo was always watching, and any sign of disloyalty could mean death, not just for him, but for everyone under his protection. Yet despite the danger, he pressed on, driven by a belief that even in the darkest times, a single act of kindness could shine through. And so, within the shadow of one of history's darkest chapters, an unlikely savior emerged, an engineer, a soldier, a man who chose humanity over obedience. The winter of 1942 descended upon Vilnius with a cruel icy grip. Snow blanketed the city in an eerie stillness, muffling the sounds of the ongoing war. But inside the walls of the HKP 562 labor camp, the tension was anything but quiet. Major Karl Plagge walked briskly through the corridors of the repair facility, his uniform crisp, his demeanor as rigid as ever. To any observer, he was a loyal German officer devoted to the Reich's cause. But beneath the surface, his heart pounded with a different mission, one far more dangerous. By now, Plagge had built a network within the factory, carefully selecting Jewish workers who possessed skills that the German military deemed valuable. Welders, mechanics, carpenters, each one of them a life saved for now. He knew that the illusion he had created could shatter at any moment. The SS patrols were becoming more frequent, their questions sharper, their eyes more suspicious. One morning, an officer from the SS stood in the entrance of the factory, his black uniform a stark contrast against the grimy walls. Plagge felt the sweat gather at the back of his neck but forced himself to remain calm. "Major Plagge," the officer greeted him, his voice laced with suspicion. "We hear whispers that your factory is unusually efficient, perhaps even too efficient." Plagge met his gaze, his face an unreadable mask. "Efficiency is our priority, Obersturmführer," he replied smoothly. "After all, every vehicle repaired here returns to the front faster. The Führer demands nothing less." The officer's eyes scanned the workers, watching their every move. Plagge had drilled them well. Keep working, keep your heads down, never speak unless spoken to. Despite their outward composure, he could feel their fear vibrating through the air. Plagge led the officer through the factory, pointing out the meticulous work done by his team. Inside, he knew that the workers were barely surviving. Rationed food, long hours, and constant terror. Yet, he had done what he could to ensure their survival. The medical station, though underfunded, had a secret stash of antibiotics smuggled in through bribed Wehrmacht contacts. The barracks were colder than he'd like, but at least they were safer than the ghetto. As the inspection continued, Plagge noticed a young boy, no older than 12, struggling to carry a heavy toolbox. The officer's eyes landed on him, narrowing. "Why is a child here?" he asked coldly. Plagge's mind raced. "He's the son of one of our senior workers. He has a gift for precision work, tiny hands, you see. Ideal for engine repairs." He forced a smile, hoping it masked his anxiety. The officer gave a skeptical nod, but said nothing more. As they moved on, Plagge discreetly exhaled, another crisis averted. For now. Later that evening, as the factory emptied out, Plagge sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the papers spread across his desk. Forged work permits, falsified reports, and lists of names, each one representing a life hanging in the balance. He knew that the longer he continued, the higher the stakes became. His colleagues in the Wehrmacht were growing restless, sensing something unusual about his operations. And if the SS caught wind of his true intentions, it would be the end, for him and for the hundreds under his protection. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Dr. Miriam Kozlowski, the camp's designated physician, one of the few people Plagge could trust. She entered cautiously, her eyes scanning the hallway behind her. "Major," she whispered, "we need more supplies. The men are getting weaker. If they collapse at their stations..." Plagge nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I'll see what I can do. But it's getting harder. The SS are circling like vultures." Miriam hesitated, then placed a trembling hand on the desk. "You're risking too much. Why? Why are you doing this? Why are..." For a long moment, Plagge didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I cannot stand by and watch innocent people be slaughtered, not while I still have the power to change it." The two sat in silence, the weight of their reality pressing down on them. Plagge knew he couldn't save everyone, but if he could save just a few more, it would be worth the risk. The air inside the HKP 562 compound was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and quiet desperation. Each passing day brought new challenges, new dangers. For Major Karl Plagge, the weight of his deception was growing heavier, pressing down on him like an iron fist. The illusion he had so carefully crafted, of a loyal German officer simply running an efficient repair unit, was beginning to show cracks. One morning, a chilling rumor spread through the factory like wildfire. The SS was planning another inspection, and this time, it wouldn't be a routine check. Word had reached Plagge that the authorities suspected sabotage within the ranks. The mere thought of it sent shivers down his spine. If they dug too deep, If they uncovered the truth, it would mean the end for him, and for the hundreds of lives he had worked so hard to protect. He paced his office, staring at the factory blueprints pinned to the wall. Every corner of the workshop had been optimized for both production and secrecy. Hidden compartments under workbenches concealed forbidden food rations. Workers' records were forged with meticulous precision. But would it be enough to survive another inspection? That evening, he gathered his most trusted men, those who understood the unspoken mission they shared. Among them was Abram Weiss, a seasoned mechanic whose hands bore the scars of years of hard labor. "They're coming," Plagge said in a low voice. "We need to make sure they find nothing." Weiss, his face etched with worry, nodded. "We've hidden what we can, Major. But if they look closer this time..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Plagge exhaled sharply. "No mistakes. No fear. We've come too far." The next day, the factory was tense, the workers moving with deliberate caution. Every glance was laced with silent terror. When the SS vehicles arrived, the sharp clatter of boots against concrete echoed through the workshop. 2 officers in black uniforms stepped inside, their eyes cold and calculating. Plagge stood tall, his hands folded behind his back in an attempt to appear indifferent. Major Plagge, the taller of the officers, greeted him, his lips curling into a thin smile. "We have reason to believe that subversive activities are taking place within your workforce. We're here to investigate." Plagge's heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "You're welcome to inspect, Obersturmführer. Efficiency and order are paramount here." The officers fanned out, scrutinizing every inch of the facility. They opened toolboxes, inspected workstations, and interrogated workers at random. Plagge kept a close watch, subtly guiding their attention away from areas that could reveal too much. At one point, an officer paused near a storage room door. Behind it lay a hidden compartment stuffed with extra food and medical supplies. "What's in here?" the officer asked, his hand on the door handle. Plagge forced a chuckle, stepping forward. "Nothing of importance, just spare parts and outdated machinery. But you're welcome to take a look, though I warn you, it's a mess inside." The officer hesitated, then retracted his hand, giving Plagge a sharp look. "We'll see about that." Minutes stretched into hours, and when the SS finally left, Plagge felt the tension ease ever so slightly. He turned to his workers, their faces pale with fear but alive. They had made it through this time. Later that night, Plagge sat alone in his office, staring out into the darkness. He knew this victory was fleeting. The next inspection, the next question, the next misstep could bring it all crashing down. But for now, they had survived. And as long as he could still manipulate the system, he would continue to fight in his own quiet, dangerous way. By 1943, the situation in Vilnius had grown increasingly dire. The liquidation of the Jewish ghettos was in full swing, and the Gestapo's grip tightened with each passing day. Major Karl Plagge, stationed at the HKP 562 forced labor camp, knew that time was running out. The workers under his command, mostly Jewish men deemed essential to the German war effort, were living on borrowed time. Plagge had used his influence within the Wehrmacht to secure the creation of the HKP 562 labor camp on Subach Street, arguing that skilled Jewish laborers were vital to keeping military vehicles operational. But he knew that the SS did not share his pragmatic view. They saw only one future for the Jewish people: annihilation. In the fall of 1943, word spread through the camp that the SS was planning an inspection. Unlike previous visits, this one was to be conducted by high-ranking officers who suspected irregularities in Plagge's management. The workers, many of whom had already witnessed the horrors of the ghetto, understood the gravity of the situation. A mistake, a misplaced document, or even the wrong answer to a question could mean death. Plagge moved quickly. He called a meeting with his most trusted staff, other Wehrmacht officers who shared his disdain for the regime's cruelty. He instructed them to review all records meticulously and ensure that every worker had valid documentation. The camp's blacksmiths and mechanics were ordered to appear busy, their stations spotless and efficient. He emphasized the importance of discipline, knowing that any sign of disorder would invite suspicion. When the SS finally arrived, their presence was suffocating. Officers marched through the facility, inspecting every corner with cold precision. They questioned workers at random, their eyes scanning faces for signs of deception. Plagge, standing tall in his uniform, answered their inquiries with the practiced ease of a man who had long mastered the art of subterfuge. At one point, an SS officer stopped at the medical station, scrutinizing a sick worker too weak to stand. Plagge intervened quickly, stating that the man was recovering from an injury sustained while repairing a vehicle critical to the war effort. He emphasized the importance of maintaining the workforce's health, ensuring that every man was needed to keep the factory running. The officer, seemingly satisfied, moved on. Plagge's ability to manipulate the system bought his workers more time, but he knew it was a temporary reprieve. He continued to work behind the scenes, issuing work permits to Jewish families and providing subtle warnings about upcoming SS operations. His quiet defiance carried immense personal risk, yet he persisted, driven by a moral obligation that far outweighed the threat of discovery. As the inspection concluded and the SS departed, a collective sigh of relief spread through the camp. But Plagge understood the reality. This was only a battle won in an ongoing war of survival. The Gestapo's eyes were always watching, and the next visit could come at any moment. By the spring of 1944, Major Karl Plagge knew that the end was drawing near. The Soviet Red Army was advancing towards Vilnius, and the German war machine was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own brutality. Rumors spread throughout the HKP 562 forced labor camp that the SS was planning a final cleansing operation, one that would erase any remaining traces of Jewish laborers before the Soviets could arrive. The camp had become a fragile sanctuary, but Plagge was painfully aware that its protection would not last much longer. His fears were confirmed in July 1944 when he received intelligence that the SS was preparing for the liquidation of the camp. The Jews who had managed to survive under his watchful eye were now in immediate danger. In a desperate attempt to save them, Plagge took a bold risk. He gathered the camp's workers in the assembly hall, standing before them with an expression that betrayed the urgency of the situation. With carefully chosen words that could not be construed as treasonous by any eavesdroppers, he warned them of the impending danger. "You must be prepared to leave soon," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "Those who can find places to hide should do so without delay." The message was clear. Escape while there was still time. Plagge's warning ignited a flurry of activity. Some workers had already made plans, securing hiding spots in the attics and basements of sympathetic Lithuanians. Others had no choice but to take their chances in the forests beyond Vilnius, where partisan resistance groups were known to operate. Those who couldn't escape prepared for the worst, knowing that their fates were no longer in their hands. On July 1st, 1944, the SS began their final liquidation efforts. They conducted exhaustive searches throughout the camp, ripping apart makeshift hiding places and interrogating those left behind. Despite their efforts, they could not account for all the missing workers. By the time they realized the extent of the escape, the Red Army was closing in, forcing them to accelerate their operations. For those who remained, the reality was grim. Approximately 250 prisoners, primarily women, children, and elderly men who had been too weak or unable to escape, were rounded up and transported to the infamous Ponary Forest. There they were executed alongside thousands of others who had fallen victim to Nazi atrocities. Meanwhile, Plagge struggled to maintain his facade. He continued to insist to his superiors that all workers were accounted for, even as suspicions grew. The pressure mounted with each passing day, and it became clear that his efforts to shield the workers were nearing their end. On July 13, 1944, Vilnius fell to the advancing Soviet forces. The remaining prisoners who had hidden within the camp emerged cautiously, their survival a testament to Plagge's warning. Though their freedom was bittersweet, they knew they owed their lives to the German officer who had defied the odds to protect them. As the Soviet forces pressed deeper into the city, chaos erupted within the remaining German forces. The once formidable Wehrmacht was now in full retreat, and Vilnius was a city on the brink of liberation. In the confusion, some of Plagge's former workers managed to slip out of hiding and seek refuge among the advancing Red Army. But for those still in the camp, the fear of discovery remained a constant shadow. The SS, desperate to erase any remaining evidence of their atrocities, launched a series of brutal raids on suspected hideouts. In the days leading up to Vilnius's fall, gunfire echoed through the streets as soldiers hunted down escapees. The surviving Jews who remained in hiding could hear the distant explosions and knew that their only hope lay in enduring just a little longer. Plagge, still operating within the rapidly collapsing German command structure, used his position to delay reports and falsify records, buying precious hours for those in hiding. He walked a perilous line, deflecting questions and feigning ignorance when pressed about missing workers. Every encounter with the SS brought the risk of exposure, but his carefully maintained image of a loyal officer remained his strongest shield. By the evening of July 12th, the city was in chaos. Soviet artillery pounded German positions, sending plumes of smoke billowing into the sky. In the camp, those still hidden held their breath, listening for signs that the nightmare was coming to an end. In the streets, German officers abandoned their posts, leaving behind remnants of the once meticulously maintained occupation. When the Red Army finally entered Vilnius on July 13th, they were met with scenes of devastation. Survivors emerged from their hiding places cautiously, many unsure if it was truly safe. The camp, once a place of quiet resistance under Plagge's watchful eye, now stood eerily silent. But even with the Germans gone, survival was not guaranteed. The Soviet forces, though liberators, viewed anyone associated with the Germans with suspicion. For the Jewish survivors, a new chapter of uncertainty was beginning, and for Karl Plagge, the weight of his choices would linger long after the war's end. On July 13, 1944, Vilnius fell to the advancing Soviet forces. The surviving prisoners who had hidden within the camp emerged cautiously, their survival a testament to Plagge's warning. Though their freedom was bittersweet, they knew they owed their lives to the German officer who had defied the odds to protect them. Plagge and his unit evacuated Vilnius just before the Soviet occupation, retreating westward with the collapsing German front. Despite his efforts to protect Jewish lives, he was still bound by his duties to the Wehrmacht. In the chaotic months that followed, he found himself stationed in various locations, witnessing the inevitable downfall of the Nazi regime. By the end of 1944, the German front was in full retreat on all sides. Plagge, burdened by the weight of his actions and the horrors he had witnessed, began documenting his experiences in private notes, an attempt to reconcile his role within the war. Meanwhile, Jewish survivors who had fled from HKP 562 faced a difficult winter, many hiding in forests or seeking refuge with partisans. As the war drew closer to its final stages, the question of accountability loomed over Plagge and his fellow officers. He knew that liberation would bring scrutiny and judgment, and he hoped that the lives he had saved would one day stand as proof of his defiance against the Nazi atrocities. As 1945 dawned, the Third Reich was collapsing under the relentless pressure of Allied forces. The once mighty German war machine, which had conquered vast swathes of Europe, was now reduced to a desperate defensive struggle. Major Karl Plagge, stationed in Western Germany after retreating from Vilnius, watched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that Hitler's reign of terror was nearing its end, but he also feared what would come next. For himself, for his men, and for the Jewish workers he had tried so hard to save. With each passing day, Plagge wrestled with guilt and uncertainty. The brutal liquidation of the HKP 562 camp in July 1944 haunted him. He had done everything within his power to warn the prisoners, to protect them, but was it enough? His journal entries from this time reveal a man burdened by the weight of his moral choices. In one passage he wrote, "I cannot erase the faces of those who perished. I see them in my dreams and I wonder, did I do enough? Could I have saved more? And if I could have, why didn't I?" As the Allied bombers rained destruction upon German cities, Plagge focused on his work in military logistics, knowing full well that defeat was inevitable. Frankfurt, where he was stationed, was reduced to rubble. Train lines were severed, supply chains crumbled, and the morale of the Wehrmacht had all but disintegrated. Officers whispered of surrender, of desertion, but Plagge remained steadfast in his own mission, survival and accountability. By early March 1945, American forces had crossed the Rhine, breaching the once formidable German defenses. Frankfurt was now in their crosshairs, and chaos erupted in the city. Desperate civilians looted abandoned warehouses, seeking food and shelter. Plagge, watching from his office window, saw the suffering of his own people, and reflected on the suffering inflicted upon others under the Nazi regime. He knew that the day of reckoning was near. When American forces entered Frankfurt in late March, Plagge chose not to flee. Unlike many of his fellow officers who shed their uniforms and attempted to disappear, he reported to the authorities voluntarily. He was taken to an Allied detention center, where he faced interrogation. During these questioning sessions, Plagge spoke candidly about his role in the Wehrmacht and his efforts to shield Jewish laborers. The interrogators were initially skeptical. They had heard similar defenses from many captured officers, most of whom were attempting to evade responsibility. But Plagge's testimony was different. He provided meticulous details, dates, names, and actions taken to protect prisoners from the SS. His sincerity was undeniable. One American intelligence officer later recalled, "He was not like the others. He did not try to justify the regime. He spoke of guilt, of regret, and of the burden he carried. It was clear that he had fought his own war within the war." The turning point in Plagge's case came when Jewish survivors of HKP 562, who had fled to the west, learned of his capture. They came forward, eager to testify on his behalf. One survivor, Moshe Shapiro, gave a statement that would later be pivotal in Plagge's fate. "Major Plagge was a soldier, but he was also a human being. He did not have to warn us, but he did. He did not have to protect us, but he did. And for that we owe him our lives." Despite this, the process of denazification was not kind. Plagge found himself facing judgment not only from the Allies but from his own conscience. He attended hearing after hearing, where he was categorized as a fellow traveler, a man who had served within the Nazi system, but who had shown moral opposition to its crimes. After being released from detention, Plagge returned to civilian life, working quietly as an engineer in post-war Germany. The country was a shell of its former self, divided, demoralized, and haunted by the horrors of the past. He rarely spoke of his time in Vilnius, preferring to bury his memories in the routines of daily life. However, the survivors of HKP 562 did not forget him. They tirelessly lobbied for his recognition, gathering testimonies and submitting documents to various institutions. Their efforts culminated in 2005 when Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust Remembrance Center, recognized Karl Plagge as righteous among the nations. At the ceremony, one elderly survivor stood at the podium, tears in his eyes, and said, "There were many who turned their backs on us, but Karl Plagge stood with us. He gave us hope when there was none, and because of him, we lived." Karl Plagge passed away in 1957, long before he was formally honored for his bravery. His legacy, however, endures in the lives of those he saved and in the historical record that finally acknowledges his quiet defiance against an inhuman regime. His story serves as a testament to the power of individual moral courage, showing that even within the machinery of war and genocide, humanity can persist. The fall of the Third Reich may have marked the end of an era, but the stories of those who stood against it continue to inspire generations.